Hi there. So we are in chapter 14 about the Enlightenment and Revolution, and we are doing section 2, which is about the two revolutions that was influenced by the Enlightenment thinking. And today we are in lesson 2.2, the French Revolution. Recently we covered the American Revolution and how the American Revolution was heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinking. Now, this is a perfect circle for the French because the Enlightenment thinking originated from many French philosophers. For example, French philosophers like Baron de Montesquieu and Rene Rousseau. And they influenced American leaders like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and many of the founding fathers. And the French soldiers who helped the American Revolution against the British Empire, when they returned or went back to France, their influence was actually carried by these soldiers, which eventually helped them or fueled them in their own revolution. And today we'll cover a synopsis or an overview of this French Revolution. Have your books ready or log into Loda USD website and go to Clever, and from Clever log into Cengage Learning, which is the National Geographic Learning resource for world history. And from the left side, it's Unit 5, Chapter 14, Section 2, Lesson 2. And this lesson is in pages 390 to 391. Now, this chapter's essential question is, how did new ways of thinking about government and human rights led to revolution? And the objective of this lesson is to identify the cause and main events of the French Revolution. Okay, so additional information which is not in the textbook. So Louis XVI contributed to the revolutionary forces, the American Revolution, which in turn contributed to his downfall. France gave both financial and military support to the American colonists in their freedom against the Great Britain. Why? Because France is at war with the Empire of Great Britain. In 1778, France signed a Treaty of Alliance with the Americans. For the next 4 years, France provided the revolutionaries with supplies including ammunition, arms, and uniforms. In addition, French troops and France Navy provided support to the Continental Army by training them. To pay the France involvement in the war, the French government had to borrow money and raise taxes on the Third Estate. Now take note of that, taxes from the Third Estate. So this acts added to the frustration of the Third Estates and fueled their demand for a democratic government. So in 1789, France exploded into revolution. The reasons were a mix of social among the people and political among the leaders in the government, and these problems provoked people to action. The root cause of this revolution is inequality among the three main social classes called estates. The first estate was the Catholic clergy, who had significant powers and privileges such as paying very few taxes. So the first estate is the church. The second estate was the nobility, who lived in privileged isolation at the king's court in Versailles. Remember Versailles, the palace? And the nobles enjoyed lavish lifestyles, and like the members of the first estate, were only lightly taxed. Now, the third estate was the common people, the vast majority of France. The third estate has its own hierarchy as well. At the top was the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, made up of relatively prosperous and educated professionals and merchants. So it is a mixture of different classes of people, of course, with the exception of the nobility and the clergy, which is the first and the second estates. Now, beneath the bourgeoisie are the peasants, who made up the majority of the population. Hard work, hunger, poverty were the norm. We covered this. And the third estate paid the largest share of the nation taxes but had no say in the government. Again, bottom line, more taxes but no representation. If this sounds familiar, it is from the American Revolution sentiment. Taxation without representation was the main problem in the American colony. That's why it led to the American Revolution against the British Empire. Now, on top of this taxation without representation problem is the lavish lifestyle of the king and the family and friends. And who are these leaders? It's Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Now, in the years leading to the French Revolution, the wife of Louis XVI was seen by the people as a symbol of excesses of the monarchy. Born in Vienna, Austria in 1755, she was the 15th child of Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, and Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. So, well, she's a princess. Her marriage to Louis was meant to seal an alliance between Austria and France. Her extravagant taste and love of fashion earned her the nickname Madame Deficit, meaning they are not earning money for France. Instead, they are spending too much while the rest of the country starved to death. However, Marie Antoinette did not actually say the infamous line, "let them eat cake," in regards to the plight of the French people when they were looking for bread, because bread is the staple food of the French people during this time. I don't know if it's still true today. So the story goes is that French people were starving, and well, specifically French women did not have enough flour to make bread, and according to legend, she said that let them eat cake. Now, how can you eat cake if you can't even make a basic, simple French baguette? So most likely it is just a propaganda to stir up the anger of the mob that led to the French Revolution, which was, in that sense, effective. So France's old economic system only favored the rich nobles and obviously prevented the attempts at economic reform. And all across the country, the third estate was plunged into crippling poverty and hunger. While their king and queen and the family and friends are having party at the Palace of Versailles. So this political cartoon was from the 1700s, which shows the three estates, the first, the second, and the third. The third is obviously lying at the bottom. So what view does this convey of the first and second estate? What is your impression? What do you think is going on here? What is the message of this political cartoon? So that is the first half of this lesson about the three estates. Now let's talk about the end of the monarchy. Now Louis, because of this crisis, was forced to summon or call an assembly called Estates General, which had not met since 1614. As the name implies, delegates of the States General represented the states to which they belong. So the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. So at this assembly at the town of Versailles, remember Versailles, the palace where the king lives, the first and the second estates often, obviously, just manipulate any conversation about any reform. And because of this, the third estate were angered, and eventually the third estate established a new representative body called the National Assembly. So the National Assembly gave the third estate more power and was defended by armed mobs that were formed into National Guard. Louis was forced to accept the authority of the National Assembly, and eventually the National Assembly abolished the privileges of the nobles and effectively made Louis a prisoner. So in August 1789, the Assembly issued the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, which proclaimed the liberty and equality of all people. This assembly, the National Assembly, tried to form a new government in which Louis would share power with an elected legislature. However, the king refused to cooperate because obviously it will drastically reduce the power of the king and all the privileges of a king. Now, because our time is so limited for this lesson, obviously there are a lot of things that happened afterwards. There's a lot of execution. like lots of it. A lot of the nobility, the noble class, and the family of the king, and the king himself was executed. So that's the story. Now that's pretty much a summary of the French Revolution, or at least an introduction to it. Now let's go to the review and assess questions. As for number one, reading check, how did revolution change relations among France's three estates? The first, the clergy; the second estate as a group of the noble class; and the third estate, the common people, which includes the bourgeoisie and the peasant class. Number two, compare and contrast. In what ways were conditions for the three estates similar and different? Now let's go to the third review and assess question number three. Identify problems and solutions. How did the third estate seek to improve its conditions? Now go ahead, go back to our Google Classroom and open the review and assess assignment, chapter 14, section 2, two revolutions. Put all the basic information here: last name, first name, class period, and date. And of course, don't forget to put the definition of our key vocab here, bourgeoisie, and the title of the lesson, and obviously the answers to the questions. Use your own word and write in complete sentences if you are aiming for that full credit, and I think everyone should. And that is our lesson for today. Section 2.2, the French Revolution, of chapter 14.